You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 5th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. It's 1500 in Tokyo, 9 a.m. in Damascus, 7 a.m. here in London and 2 a.m. in Washington, D.C. You're listening to Monocle Radio. The Globalist starts now. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, video evidence has emerged showing Ukrainian special forces fighting alongside Syrian mercenaries in the Golan Heights. We'll get more detail on the story. In Australia, the Defence Minister says that foreign nationals may join the Defence Forces. Why is this needed and how will it work? We'll have a look through the front pages, and in Britain, one story dominates.
I believe all our plans are compliant with our international obligations, but if I'm forced to choose between securing our borders and our country's security or a foreign court, I'm going to choose our country's security every single time.
The first televised debate between the leadership candidates in the UK election took place last night. We'll analyse the performances of Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer. In the US, Joe Biden has come under heavy criticism for curbing migrant arrivals at the US-Mexico border.
Come here today to do what the Republicans in Congress refuse to do. Take the necessary steps to secure our border.
We'll look at what the new bill specifies and how it might affect Washington's relationship with the new Mexican leader. We'll be in Tokyo to find out why Japan is banning outdoor drinking in one upscale neighbourhood. How big is the problem of over-tourism and what other measures are being taken? And we'll stop by the book town of Hay-on-Wye to hear how the decision of the festival to dump their major sponsor, Baillie Gifford, is reverberating around the culture sector in the UK. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. The Republican-led US House of Representatives passed legislation that could impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court over its prosecutor's decision to seek arrest warrants for Israeli officials related to the war in Gaza. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is meeting his allies today to discuss forming the government, a day after his Hindu Nationalist Party lost its outright majority in Parliament in a surprise election verdict. And the United States and its G7 partners are making progress on finding ways to provide more urgently needed funds to Ukraine by tapping the value of profits earned on frozen Russian assets. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, the Kyiv Post says it has obtained exclusive videos of Ukrainian special forces fighting alongside Syrian mercenaries as they attack Russian fighters supporting Bashar al-Assad's forces in Syria. The journalist who wrote the article sent us this about the report.
My name is Katerina Zakharchenko and I'm a journalist for the Kyiv Post. A Ukrainian military intelligence source that I spoke to, a condition of anonymity, said that active fighting continues in the southern part of the country, particularly in Golan Heights, where Russian troops are currently concentrated. As well, my source said that enemy checkpoints, foot patrols, military convoys and other military objects are under regular attack since the beginning of this year. Such action by Ukrainian special services are important, essential even, because Russia is now also recruiting mercenaries in Syria and sending them to the front in Ukraine. Last May, Ukraine's intelligence chief Kirill Budanov promised to destroy Russian war criminals anywhere in the world, wherever they are, and this action only proves his word.
Well, I'm joined now by Daniela Peled, who's managing editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Daniela, can you remind us of why there are Russians fighting in Syria?
Russia is a long-term ally of Syria. In 2015, Russian troops intervened in the civil war on the side of the regime. Many believe this is the decisive move that won the war in favour of the regime. They carried out a truly brutal campaign of bombing, in which huge numbers of civilians died, and thousands of Russian troops are still there in Syria, including air defense systems and warplanes.
So, what are the Ukrainian special forces doing in Syria?
Well, as we just heard, the operation with Syrian rebels against both mercenaries, Russian mercenaries, and Assad's troops seems to have been going on at least since the beginning of the year in southwest Syria. The fact that the source comes from from Ukrainian intelligence seems to indicate that Kyiv would like the world to know about this. The extent is not clear, but they seem to be quite well embedded, using RPGs and mortar fire and IEDs to attack a range of Russian targets, including checkpoints and patrols and convoys of military equipment.
And does this go the other way? Are there Syrians fighting with Russia in Ukraine?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's been a huge number of reports, and it makes sense as well, especially if you consider that a decade of war left a lot of Syrian young men with no skills apart from fighting. They've been reported at least a couple of thousand of Syrians fighting with the Russians. I mean, of course, the Russians have imported all kinds of recruits for their war in Ukraine as well. It was press ganging Central Asians and offering all kinds of incentives, including Russian citizenship. But certainly there is a Syrian presence in Ukraine.
And Syrians fighting alongside Ukrainians?
Well, the Ukrainians have a number of international troops, if you like. There are all kinds of international volunteers, but Syria and Russia are, as I said, consistent and long-term allies. So pro-regime Syrians would not be fighting alongside Ukrainians.
I mean, given that Ukraine appears so short of manpower, how is it possible and why is it necessary that Ukrainian soldiers are active away from the immediate front line?
Well, of course, I mean, this is what's surprising, since Ukraine is very notably struggling at home. They've been, as the war goes on, more and more men of army age seem reluctant to serve, especially since the war is not going so well. They're putting in all kinds of moves to try and recruit more people. I mean, this is a limited special forces operation, and I think it's pretty useful for psyops as well, and for morale, especially to have this known now. But of course, Russia isn't fighting also a bilateral war with Ukraine. Russia has got interests and occupations all around the world. In the European sphere, that it has its bases in Transnistria and the breakaway region of Moldova. It occupies 20% of Georgia. It's fighting on a number of fronts, and as Ukrainian journalists just made clear, the idea that Ukraine will hunt down Russian war criminals and Russian aggressors all around the world is a really powerful psychological message to send.
I mean, yes, because we understand that Ukrainian special forces continue their hunt for the pro-Kremlin Wagner mercenaries in Sudan. Do we have any detail on that? Yes,
absolutely. This has been reported that they're fighting the Wagner mercenaries in Sudan, and also, I mean, there are certainly plans that have been drawn up to fight the Russians on a number of fronts. Also in Syria, a year ago, there was the Washington Post reported these really very detailed plans to strike Russian troops and Wagner mercenaries in Syria. That was halted by Zelensky, and that was important because the plans were for deniable attacks. It looks now that Ukraine doesn't want to deny that possibility anymore.
And finally, I just wonder how reliable this information coming out of the Kyiv Post is, if these videos have been verified, and why now? Why is this being released to the world?
Well, you look, I can only conjecture, but as I said, things are going really quite. I wouldn't say badly, but really not well for Ukraine. Global attention has shifted as it would after 2 years of fighting, but also with the conflict in Gaza. It's no longer seen as this sort of pivotal moment of the West versus Russia. And really, Ukraine needs to have a central role in world affairs. And also, to me, it would make sense to show as a demonstration of Ukrainian power and Ukrainian intent that they have the capacity and the will and the ability to fight beyond their borders. And of course, this is not happening without US agreement and potentially coordination.
Daniela, thank you very much indeed. That's Daniela Peled there from the Institute of War and Peace Reporting. This is The Globalist. In Australia, the Defence Forces have announced that recruits from foreign countries may enlist with the Australian Defence Forces, the ADF. The country's keen to enlarge its armed forces in the face of growing regional threats. Well, I'm joined now by reporter Paul Osborne on the line from Brisbane. Paul, why does Australia struggle with enlistment?
Well, it's far from the only Western country that struggles to find recruits to the military. The United Kingdom is struggling to find recruits, many European nations. We've heard some countries even talk about bringing back forms of conscription, of military service, to try and boost numbers amid these rising concerns about the increasingly muscular positions taken by Russia and China. And of course, it's China in particular that worries Australia. Now, Australia has lost a significant proportion of its military personnel. Since 2021, I think it's lost quite a proportion since COVID. The ADF, the Australian Defence Force, is currently around 4,500 short of its target strength, which is 63,500 full-time personnel. And indeed, the government wants to expand that significantly. It wants 80,000 full-timers in the forces by 2040. So it needs to find ways to recruit them. And it says, frankly, it isn't able to do that from Australian citizens, in part. Unemployment levels are pretty low in Australia, and that's making it harder to attract the military. There's been some bad publicity. There was a royal commission into defence and veteran suicides, which pointed to a number of issues in the forces, particularly allegations of bullying and of a culture of silence. So while the government is increasing defence spending, it's talking about buying new kit, investing to make Australia a bigger regional power, it is struggling to find people to fill the roles, to use all that kit that they're buying, which is why they're now looking in a relatively limited way at opening it up to non-Australian citizens.
So which foreign nationals will be able to join the ADF?
So at the start of next month in July, New Zealanders will be allowed to join. Now, to qualify, they will need to have lived in Australia for at least a year. So there is obviously that relationship between Australia and New Zealand that allows relatively easier movement between the two countries. But you would need to have lived in Australia for 12 months before you could join. Then at the beginning of next year, permanent residents in Australia who are originally from the United States or Britain or Canada would be able to apply. Now, the thing that links those countries is that those are the five nations in the Five Eyes intelligence sharing partnership. They have close defence relationships already. It is less controversial to open up entry to the Australian forces to members of citizens of the United Kingdom or the United States, for example, than it will be for other countries. Those non-citizens, though, have to meet the ADF's entry requirements. They can't have been a member of a foreign military force in the last 2 years. And also, after 90 days service in the forces, they would be eligible for Australian citizenship. But not only would they be eligible, they would be expected to take up that eligibility. They would be expected to become Australian citizens. So it is also a route to Australian citizenship for people who otherwise would have to wait a little bit longer as permanent residents to meet the threshold.
Now, you mentioned China and Russia briefly. Tell us more about Australia's need to beef up the forces.
There is a obviously growing tension across the Asia-Pacific about China's increasingly aggressive operations in the region. A few years ago, Australia signed up to the AUKUS partnership with the UK and the US. That's the deal where Australia gets a fleet of submarines powered by US nuclear technology. There have been skirmishes. There have been the same arguments between the different forces. Recently, Australia accused China of endangering one of its Navy helicopters, saying they'd had flares dropped in their path as they flew over the Yellow Sea. That was the subject of what was described as a very frank conversation between Richard Marles, who's the Australian Defence Minister, and his Chinese counterpart at a defence forum in Singapore a few days ago. Now, obviously, China doesn't just go after Australian forces operating in the seas in the Asia-Pacific. It does that to many other nations. But Australia is increasingly aware of the difficult position it could find itself in the future and the need to have a more muscular military. It just can't get the numbers.
And in terms of recruitment, is there gender equality?
Not at the moment, no. There's a significant gender inequality. And like I think a lot of military forces, the Australian military, struggles to attract women to join the forces. I mentioned that Royal Commission into the state of defence, in particular to issues around veteran suicides. It pointed to all sorts of problems around the culture inside the military. There have been allegations of abuses carried out, for example, by Australian forces in Afghanistan. There have been trials linked to that. Recently, of course, we had a whistleblower who first alerted people to some of those allegations, became the first person to be sent to prison in connection with those allegations, the whistleblower, rather than anyone who had been accused of any wrongdoing. There is, I think, this sense, I think, in a lot of militaries that there is a greater awareness now of the culture in the military and how it dissuades many people, particularly women, from wanting to join up. But I think the action to change that is something that is probably going to take a lot longer, and probably longer than it would take to make a significant impact on that recruitment target. Remember, the Australians are looking to hire 17,000 more people to the forces by the end of the next decade. And that's not counting all the people who will leave in the meantime.
But this new initiative is aimed equally at men and women.
Yeah, I mean, they like a lot of forces will say that they are open to all, that they encourage anybody who is interested in a career in the military in coming forward. That the issues on gender balance are improving, as I think they are for quite a few forces, but the disparity, I think, is still there.
And Paul, finally, has there been any opposition to this? Is there pushback?
Well, governments don't tend to walk into too much difficulty when they talk about investing in the military and wanting strong military forces. But there was a sort of slight miscommunication of the plan, which caused headaches for the Labour government in Australia. And as the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, was announcing this, a junior minister gave an interview in which he said that eventually the opportunity to join the ADF would be expanded beyond the Five Eyes nations to all permanent residents of Australia, regardless of their original country of citizenship. Now, that led people to immediately say, so, for example, you could be a Chinese citizen who is a permanent resident of Australia, who under that policy would then be allowed to join the Australian Defence Forces. Now, Richard Marles then said, no, it is restricted to New Zealand, the UK, the United States, and Canada. But that confusion then allowed the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, to say that the government's handling of this had been a dog's breakfast. I cannot state to you how important the Australian government views hiring people from outside Australia itself, or hiring non-Australian citizens. At the moment, the government hopes to hire 350 personnel in the next 12 months. That is a tiny proportion of that number they need by 2040. And they are expecting almost all of those new recruits to be non-citizens. So they need this to go well.
Paul Osborne, thank you very much indeed. Still to come on the programme.
It seems hypocritical for fossil-free books to say it's all right for them to use these companies, but it's not all right for Hay Festival to receive funding. The more important question, I think, is what does this mean for our arts sector?
We'll look at the ructions in the world of culture as a major sponsor is dumped for its relatively minor connections to the oil industry. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries. over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
This is Monocle Radio. I'm Georgina Godwin and we'll continue with today's newspapers now. Joining me in the studio is Zoe Grunewald, who is the Westminster editor at The Lead. Zoe, welcome to the studio. Of course, everybody in Britain, or people who are politically engaged, were watching the TV debates last night between Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer. It was the first debate. What's the verdict in today's papers?
So, yes, it was the first debate of the general election season. We have Keir Starmer, who is has a poll lead of about 20 points. It's widely anticipated that he will enter number 10 as the country's new Prime Minister in 5 weeks' time. And the verdict on last night's debate was that it was very shouty. The two were sparring over many issues. They didn't get a lot of time to cover policy in great detail. There was a Snap YouGov opinion poll after that gave that said that Rishi Sunak actually won the debate. 51% of people said that. 49% said Keir Starmer. But when you looked into those opinion poll ratings, people said that actually Keir Starmer came across slightly better. He came across more empathetic. They trusted him considerably more. Yet for some reason, the public decided that Rishi Sunak won the debate, which I think says something quite interesting about how we regard our prime ministers and what we think they should give to us. So a very interesting verdict there. But yes, lots of issues to get into, but not a lot of time to get into them. So I think that's what most people took away from the debate.
Absolutely. I mean, just from its very opening moments where the two of them looked like frightened rabbits in the headlight. They looked perhaps like AI versions of themselves. It was just quite cringe-making, I found, just the sort of opening shots. And then they went on to discuss, of course, many pertinent issues, including the possible withdrawal from the European Court of Human Rights. Tell us what Sunak said on that.
So this has been an issue that's sort of tearing the Conservative Party apart a little bit because they have made illegal immigration such a large part of their Conservative campaign. There's been lots of pressure from the right of the party for the UK government to exit the European Convention on Human Rights because they say the European Convention on Human Rights has prevented us from being able to deport illegal migrants. So they were asked about it. Keir Starmer was very adamant, and this is a big dividing line between Labour and the Conservatives. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was extremely adamant that the UK would not leave the European Convention on Human Rights. He said, "We are a world leader in our international obligations. We would not remove ourselves from foreign courts." Keir Starmer's background, interestingly, also is as a human rights lawyer. So it's not at all surprising that he would defend the UK staying in the ECHR. Rishi Sunak, on the other hand, said that he believed that the UK's sovereignty over its borders absolutely became first. And although he did not commit to leaving the ECHR, did not say it would be in the manifesto, he indicated that it could be and that the government would be prepared to take that action if they weren't able to, in inverted commas, get control over their borders.
The National Health Service, of course, another huge issue for both parties. There was actually a lot of laughter from the audience when Rishi Sunak appeared to just ignore reality.
Yeah, so the NHS is obviously a huge part of the general election campaign. It always is. People say it's the closest thing Brits have to a religion is our National Health Service. But it's absolutely beleaguered with problems at the minute, very, very long waiting times. And Keir Starmer challenged Rishi Sunak. Keir Starmer challenged Rishi Sunak to explain whether waiting lists were coming down if they're at 7.5 million now compared to 7.2 million when Rishi Sunak came into government. So they had this sort of awkward back and forth. And as you say, the audience started laughing because Rishi Sunak was insisting that they were coming down, and Keir Starmer actually pulled him up on his figures and said, actually, they've gone up since you came into power. So that was one of those moments where we sort of saw the veneer of professionality slip from Sunak face, because it is really hard for the government to defend its record on the NHS when we're consistently seeing waiting lists going up and the NHS pressure is getting far worse.
Tax, of course, huge issue there.
Yep, tax, absolutely. So Rishi Sunak kept repeating this line that Labour would bring in £2,000 in higher taxes for every working family in our country. And Keir Starmer wasn't really quick enough to come back on this. And part of that is to do with the timings of the debate and how little time leaders had to answer. But eventually Keir Starmer insisted that that figure was completely made up. It was made up by Conservative special advisors who had put Labour projections they thought the Labour Party might bring in and done analysis on it. And he said that actually the £2,000 figure is just in the Conservative making. It's not actually a Labour figure at all. But he wasn't really quick enough to rebut it in the first place. So Rishi Sunak kept repeating it. And even today and after the debate, we saw leading Conservative figures repeat this line that Labour would bring in £2,000 in extra taxes. It actually leads some of the headlines in the newspapers today as well. So this is going to be a difficult thing for Labour. It's sort of out there now. And once it's out there, it's very hard to put it back in the box, even if it's not true.
Just before we leave this subject, as you say, it was very short. They were only given 45 seconds to answer each. How helpful is the format of that kind of debate?
I don't find it very helpful at all. And I think the key thing to say is that in these head-to-head sparring election debates, they actually don't tend to move the opinion polls very much at all. In 2010, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, there was Clegg mania. Everybody thought he did fantastically well in the debates, but the Lib Dems barely saw their opinion polls shift. So they don't really have much impact. But absolutely, as you say, there are so many issues facing Britain today, and to give each leader 45 seconds to explain their entire policy on the NHS and come back on any criticisms, I think is actually not very helpful. And really, this is about testing the personal approval ratings of both leaders.
Yeah. Now, as you mentioned, of course, immigration big on the agenda, and asylum seekers in Australia too in the headlines today. The Guardian's covering the story about a number of asylum seekers on Nauru, which is an island off the coast of Australia, has gone up. Australia's transferred people who've arrived by boat. Tell us more.
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and I find this really interesting from a UK domestic policy perspective as well, because the UK government has implemented their own offshoring policy for migrants, where they are planning to send illegal migrants or asylum seekers to Rwanda to do their offshoring and detention. And they have modelled it on the Australian model, and they say the Australian model works really well as a deterrent. It stops people from coming over because they know that if they do, they'll get deported. But actually, this story is really interesting because it's saying actually, Australia seems to be struggling with this deterrent. More and more people are coming over. They're being offshored to Nauru. And that, their policy of deterrence seems to be under strain. They say there were 3 boats arriving in a single week to Australia in May. So it's really interesting that, there's often this argument that deterrence is the best way of preventing asylum seekers. But actually, it seems like the push factors will always be stronger than the deterrent. If people want to get in a dangerous small boat and cross, they'll do it either way, because clearly whatever's there at home for them is stark enough to put them in there.
Yeah. Now, of course, the European elections are coming up this weekend. If the Europe does swing right, as is expected, migration will become even more difficult for people fleeing very difficult situations. There's been a letter from Holocaust survivors to young Europeans about not voting for the far right.
That's absolutely right. So the open letter was coordinated by Avaz, which is a global citizens web movement to promote people power. It's a group of Holocaust survivors. So they've issued this joint appeal before the European Parliament election, basically urging younger voters to exercise their right to prevent the far right from gaining power. For millions of you, the European poll is the first election in your life. For many of us, it could be the last, say the 8 survivors. So really strong words there, evoking what happened in the 1930s, in the 1940s in Europe, and comparing the AfD in Germany to, in many ways, to the rise of Nazism in Germany and across Europe. So I think it's a really stark reminder of the fact that actually, there is still a lot of far-right influence in Europe, and more young people, because of social media, are seeing these messages and being taken in by them. So they're just basically making these comparisons between the two governments and saying, actually, exercise your power to keep the far right out of government, vote with your heart, and remember what happened in the 1930s and 40s.
Remembrance is a big issue in this piece in The Independent. It's about AI bringing back the deceased. You can actually have conversations with your dead relatives. I find it very, very disturbing.
Yeah, I think either you find it very disturbing or some people find it very reassuring. So now we're seeing all these innovative means of AI being used. But in this case, it's lots of different AI programs that are being created to help people with their grief. So simulating the voice or the tone of your loved one so you can have conversations with them after they've passed. In some cases, you can sort of go through simulations of stories. So there's one father in here who lost his daughter who talks about her going to prom night. He's able to kind of live that out through an AI system. I mean, it does sound quite morbid, but I guess it's really interesting that for some people, this could be quite a helpful way of coping with their grief. And, people trying to contact or simulate a deceased person goes back histories. You can talk about seances and people trying to contact loved ones through mediums. So clearly AI is kind of filling this space as it is with so many other scenarios in our lives.
Zoe, thank you very much indeed. That's Zoe Grunewald there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. The Republican-led US House of Representatives passed legislation that would impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court over its prosecutor's decision to seek arrest warrants for Israeli officials related to the war in Gaza. The measure is not expected to become law, but reflects continuing support for Israel in Congress amid international criticism over the country's campaign in the Gaza Strip. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is meeting his allies today to discuss forming the government after his Hindu Nationalist Party lost its outright majority in Parliament in a surprise election verdict. His BJP party won 240 seats on its own, that's 32 short of the halfway mark in the decision-making lower house, according to official results announced late on Tuesday. And the G7 is making progress on finding ways to provide more urgently needed funds to Ukraine by tapping the value of profits earned on frozen Russian assets. The US has been pushing its G7 partners to embrace a loan backed by the income from the frozen assets that could provide Kyiv with as much as $50 billion in near-term funding. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. The US President Joe Biden has signed off on an executive order that will shut down asylum requests at the US-Mexico border once the average number of daily encounters exceeds a certain point. Well, I'm joined now by Monocle's US editor, Chris Lord. Chris, what does the order actually say?
So, as you mentioned there, when it goes above a certain amount, essentially the border will be closed to anybody who tries to cross the United States-Mexico border illegally, i.e. not through legitimate channels, crossing over that porous border, which, as we know, 3,700 illegal crossings happen roughly every day at the moment in the US. That's a major number. And if it goes over 2,500, which it's been that way for a long, long time. So this ban now is very much in force. It's already put into place. The administration is saying that those people who have crossed illegally will now begin to be repatriated right away. They're making no bones about the fact that this is politically very, very sensitive. They're aware that how important immigration is in the minds of a lot of voters ahead of this November election. And they mean business. And this is, in some respects, reviving Trump-era rules about the border and laws that were put in place, executive orders of this kind. But it's a little bit more nuanced than that. You will still be able to have asylum claims, but people have to have a legitimate interview set up already via an app that's provided by the Department of Homeland Security. That have to be legitimate claims, people telling people that they're going to come before they arrive, not just showing up at the border. So it's quite a profound change that's gone into effect overnight.
And will it affect other border activities such as trade?
So this has no bearing on trade. I mean, Mexico is now the main trading partner for the United States and overtook China last year. So it's not that. It's not going to affect all those many freights going back and forth over the border. But what it does do here, I think, is puts a lot of strain on that relationship. You have to remember that, in a way, Mexico, like other, in sort of situations where there are other major refugee and asylum crises around the world, Mexico now is hosting large numbers of people waiting around at the border, trying to get through to the United States, obviously creating a sort of porous situation at the border of the north of Mexico into the States, but also lots of people crossing illegally from Central America into Mexico. And there's a pretty well-developed smuggling network that the cartels in Mexico have a huge hand in. So Mexico's very conscious, I think, that in a way, it's having to manage this problem even more now because of the destination for the vast majority of the people who are traipsing across Mexico is the United States. And so this in many ways pushes it back. It slows down an already very snarled up asylum process even further, because it means that people, typically when they cross illegally, what happens is they get arrested by border guards, and then they're part of the system. Then they're actually, even though the conditions are not great, they are suddenly part of that American asylum system. And, I think now suddenly everything's back on Mexican soil. You have to understand how profound this sort of migrant crisis is, or the asylum crisis is there in this border. This is not just people coming from Venezuela or, as it was some years ago, Salvador, places that have seen, major sort of democratic rollback of or major crime waves. These are people coming from as far as Haiti, Cuba, even China. Turkey had something in the tens of thousands of people illegally trying to cross into the United States in the past year. It's an extraordinary network that's formed there. And I think suddenly this executive order, in a way, pushes back to Mexican soil and puts a lot of pressure on the Mexicans to now handle this from their side.
Well, exactly. I mean, I wonder how much cooperation the US needs from Mexican officials to carry out the executive order and if it will, in fact, be forthcoming.
Look, Mexico, it's doing a lot already to try and curb even those just getting into the country then on their way to the southern border, to the northern border, to the US. It's already forcing migrants off trains, off planes. It's busing them to the southern part of the country. It's flying some direct home to Venezuela. And under the outgoing administration of Obrador, who's just left, who's just sort of been, his successor has just been elected. But under that administration, they were even giving money to Venezuelans that they deported for 6 months, essentially to try and entice them to, sort of incentivize them to not come back. But the reality is, there's limited funding on both sides of the border for repatriation. I think there's a lot of pressure on the Biden administration for those who are being held within the United States at the moment as part of that asylum process to get them repatriated, because that is a political issue, very much so. But I think for Mexico, it's just another drain on resources to try and manage that. And also, it's at the mercy of the cartels. It's at the mercy of those smuggling gangs that are so active within the country. I think on the US side, we have to understand how important this is for this election, I think, in November, because while those numbers are very, very high of the crossings that are happening per day, there's also a wild growth of fear, and perceptions really matter when it comes to this issue. I think the Democrats and the Biden administration have really sort of underestimated how important immigration is and how high it is in the concerns of voters of many political stripes, not just those on the right, not just those in the centre, but also those in the left as well. We've seen in the last few years a lot of those states that are on the border, Texas being probably the most famous case in this, of actually the migrants on the asylum seekers that cross illegally over. Local government will put them on buses, send them up to Democrat-run cities, New York City, Washington, D.C., to make a point and say, well, the administration's border policy has caused this, and therefore the Democrats have to deal with it. Of course, that's playing politics with it here, but it does matter. And I think that immigration, a combination of some of the hype around on social media and the way the discourse on social media about what's happening there at the border, videos getting shared of, as it gets framed, an invasion of the southern border, whilst a lot of this is totally dialed up to the max and not necessarily portraying a reality, it is also sticking. And that view from a public safety angle, from a view of, is our borders secure? And frankly, on a very simple level, is Biden still in control? That is very, very important in the minds of voters. And the administration, I'm afraid, is waking up a bit late to that fact.
Chris Lord, thank you very much indeed. You're with Monocle Radio. It is 15:38 in Tokyo, that's 8:38 in Zurich. Now, Shibuya City, which is a self-governed district within Tokyo and a very popular tourist neighbourhood, is proposing to ban outdoor drinking to curb bad behaviour. Well, I'm joined now by Monocle's Fiona Wilson from Tokyo. Fiona, you actually live in Shibuya. Can you describe the neighbourhood?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a great neighbourhood when you hear this, does it, Georgina? But this is also the neighbourhood that the Monocle office and shop were in the same neighbourhood. Yeah, what's been going on is recently, say the last 10 years, Halloween has become a huge thing in Shibuya. People gather in massive numbers. New Year's Eve, the countdown, which was never a thing in Japan, has become a thing in this neighbourhood. Shibuya has this station, and it's just a gathering place. It's got this big scramble crossing, which, you know, you've seen in music videos. Every film you see about Tokyo usually features that crossing. And it's become a bit of a magnet for these big gatherings. And they were getting a bit unmanageable. And what happened was in 2018, in Halloween, there was a car was overturned. After that, the authorities clamped down. They said, right, no drinking on the streets around these particular events, Halloween and New Year's Eve. And what's happened this week is that the Shibuya authorities have decided that ban of drinking around those two periods has to be extended all year. So what they're saying is no drinking if it goes ahead. They're voting on it on June 17th. If it goes ahead, no drinking from 6 p.m. to 5 a.m. I can't imagine many people want to drink at 6 a.m. But anyway, they just want to stop people drinking on the streets, and they think it's become a problem.
Well, so how messy is a Saturday night in Shibuya?
Well, I mean, I have to say I'm not drinking on the street myself, but I do notice that what a lot of people do, they go to the convenience stores here where they sell, you know, every kind of beer you could want, and then they just stand outside, and it does become a bit of a street party. And I think in Tokyo, there's a sort of, you know, it's just an unwritten rule. You don't do that. Now, visitors who come in maybe don't know that, and they think, wow, beer's quite cheap. I'll just, you know, hang out with my friends. And it's become a little bit of a culture clash, you know, what people do here as residents and visitors coming in. So they did have to introduce these, I thought, rather bizarre patrols of security guards. They're not official police, they're hired security guards. They were going around Halloween trying to say to people, please don't drink. And it was a bit of an awkward situation. And they noticed that they were issuing warnings, and they noticed that there were more English speakers, I'm afraid to say, than Japanese speakers who needed to be told. So they've had these multilingual security guards around certain events. And I think the feeling is that what happens is you get a lot of litter. That's the biggest problem. So you've got cans all over the place. And the noise, obviously, as people drink more, it gets a bit louder. And Shibuya is a residential neighbourhood for all this amazing neon and, you know, this incredibly busy crossing. A lot of people live here, people like me. And, you know, my kid's school is just off that crossing. So it's for many people, it feels a little bit uncomfortable for it to become this sort of party town. So there's just this slightly awkward clash, if you like. And I don't think visitors really realise that they're doing anything terribly wrong. And the mayor of Shibuya, Ken Hasebe, is always trying to say we want to welcome the world. But, you know, that he's saying he hopes the visitors will drink in bars rather than on the street.
And I mean, does this go beyond Shibuya? Would you say that Japan as a whole has a problem with over-tourism? And where is that evident? Have other measures been put in place elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot this year, hasn't there, about over-tourism. Since COVID ended, I think, you know, Japan was clearly on everyone's bucket list. And March saw the highest numbers ever visiting Japan. 3 million people came to Japan for, you know, to visit. And I think there is, you know, there has to be an adjustment. You really notice it in Tokyo, just how many visitors there are. Every coffee shop overflowing. The most obscure places have got queues. I think Kyoto is probably even more acute. It's really, really difficult there. And they're tackling that by trying to introduce bus services just for the big sites so that visitors don't have to get onto public transport. That is a nuisance for them and probably for local people. You know, people are, I think they're aware it can sound a bit like we don't want visitors. So they're trying to do it in a way that is, we want visitors, we want them to have the best experience, but we don't want to disrupt the lives of locals. And I think what you've seen with the ban in Shibuya, this is what I'm hearing, the ban in Shibuya from 2019 around Halloween and New Year's Eve meant the problem was pushed into Shinjuku next door. They are now thinking about banning evening drinking at certain times of the year. So in a way, you've just moved the problem. And I think it's just a period of adjustment. You know, for a long time, Japan was this secret destination, and it definitely isn't anymore.
And I wonder how this is going to affect the local economy.
Well, it's interesting that, isn't it? I mean, Ken Hasebe, you know, is trying to say to people, go into establishments that exist and, you know, patronise the bars that are open and, enjoy that kind of drinking. So in a way that they're not saying don't spend money. They're just saying, can you please not do it on a street where people might live and kids are going home from school or whatever. So I think it's not about not welcoming people. And look, the tourism economy is booming, and I think in Kyoto they're really struggling with that balance. How do you keep this incredible boom, which is good news for the economy, for retailers, for hotels, but it's definitely not such good news for residents. So it's how you balance that out and you keep quality of life for people who live in these cities.
Fiona, thank you very much indeed. That was Fiona Wilson in Tokyo. And you can read about this story and more by signing up for our free daily newsletter, the Monocle Minute. Just head to monocle.com/minute. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
A huge row has been brewing in the arts sector in Britain. A climate divestment activist group called Fossil Free Books asked writers and artists at literary festivals, starting with Hay, to deplatform themselves in protest at these festivals' sponsorship by Baillie Gifford, an investment management company with a very small proportion of investments in fossil fuels-related assets. Well, Hay capitulated last week and dropped the sponsor. Edinburgh Festival has also dropped them, and many others may follow suit. Well, Oliver Bullough knows all about so-called dirty money, as the author of Moneyland, Why Thieves and Crooks Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back, and Butler to the World, How Britain Helps the World's Worst People Launder Money, Commit Crimes and Get Away with Anything. Oliver has also appeared frequently at Hay and other literary festivals, and he joins me down the line now from Hay on Wye. Oliver, many thanks for coming on the show. Who are Fossil Free Books? What do they want and how are they trying to achieve it?
I mean, it's a slightly shadowy organisation. I don't mean that in a sort of sinister way. It's just quite hard to tell how many of them there are and who they are. But, they purport to be a group of people involved in the literary world who are keen to make sure that anyone involved in literature and the arts divests themselves of fossil fuels. And to be honest, I think most people in this world would more or less agree with that. I think in general, we tend to be on the progressive side of politics. I think most of us would agree that, the climate crisis is, an existential crisis facing the planet. And we're all very keen to make sure that, big companies like BP and Shell don't get to launder their reputations by sponsoring arts organisations.
The whole row, though, also seemed to be conflated with the Israel-Gaza conflict. Is that reasonable?
To be honest, the whole thing is quite weird. I mean, as you said in your introduction, Baillie Gifford is not a big investor in fossil fuels. It does have a small stake. That is the nature of any investment company. They do have to invest in what their clients want them to invest in. And so I think they do have about 2% of their shares in fossil fuels if you include supermarkets, which do obviously have petrol stations on their forecourts. They've also sort of slightly weirdly been accused of holding shares in companies benefiting from the Israeli, I don't even know what the word is, horrors in Gaza. But the companies that they're accusing of involvement in that are just giant US tech companies, NVIDIA, Amazon, Alphabet, the owner of Google, and others, all of which, I mean, though they may have an involvement in Israel, they also have an involvement in almost anywhere. So that is very mysterious. It's particularly weird considering that, Baillie Gifford's primary sort of USP is its big early bets on big green companies, Tesla in particular, Northvolt, the Swedish battery maker, who are powering the transition away from fossil fuels. So the idea that Baillie Gifford is somehow a company that's living off fossil fuels and is living off the defense sector, which seems to be what Fossil Free books are saying is just completely wrong.
So why did festivals capitulate? 2 so far, but more probably on the way.
Well, as I understand it from communications from Hay, and I know a lot of people who work for the festival, it was 2 reasons. One of them, it was just getting very expensive. A lot of authors had been targeted directly by whoever fossil-free books are, and essentially had been strong-armed into pulling out, which meant that those people who'd gone to those events had to be paid back. Hay was looking at it would be costing them around £500,000, and though their sponsorship from Baillie Gifford was generous, it wasn't anything like that. So essentially it got to the point when turning away the investment was more sensible than hanging on to it, even if that was the principle. The second point was that, again, people felt bullied and targeted. Employees of the festival, people going to the festival, that people were feeling very uncomfortable. Hay Festival, I know a number of people who work there, seeing some from Hay, it has worked incredibly hard to make sure that it is as green as it can be. It is very good at recycling. It's very good at encouraging public transport, laying on buses from Hereford, which is the nearest train station, and so on. The idea that this is an organisation that's sort of, happily burning coal and, firing guns in the air just couldn't be further from the truth. So I think people who worked there felt victimised. They were worried that their authors were going to be feeling victimised as well. And considering it was now already costing them a lot more money than it was earning them, they decided to pull away from Baillie Gifford.
And what does Baillie Gifford say?
Well, Baillie Gifford has issued a series of statements that have been attempting to lay out the picture that I said earlier, I suppose, that just explaining that, it isn't a big fossil fuel investor. It isn't a big investor in Israel. What it is an investor in big tech stocks. And, those stocks, have a worldwide presence. And there isn't really any more than that they can do, because essentially the reason why they invest in literary organisations and literary festivals and the Baillie Gifford Prize, the big annual prize for non-fiction, is to attempt to obviously make themselves look good. That's why anyone advertises anywhere. So I suppose the more they talk about this, the more they look bad. So essentially, I think they're just sort of ducking their head in and rather hoping it'll go away. And I think that's probably quite sensible.
Will this mean that companies, Baillie Gifford, but others too, will divest from fossil fuels? Will it make the slightest bit of difference?
It's sort of hard to see what more they could do, really. If you say, will it ask them to divest from the companies that fossil-free books is asking them to divest from? If you just look at, say, NVIDIA, which is, one of the fastest growing stocks anywhere in the world, any investment company would be idiotic to divest from that. That's like saying you want no stake in AI going into the future, which no investment company is going to want to do. Obviously, they would far rather to pull away from sponsoring arts organisations than they would to do that. In terms of divesting from fossil fuels, well, I suppose they could try and persuade all their clients that remain with fossil fuels in their portfolios to sell them, and I'm sure they are attempting to do that. But that's going to be a slow process. It's not something they can do overnight. I suppose the more important question, I think, is what does this mean for our arts sector? Arts organisations are already turning away sponsorship from actual fossil fuel companies. If Baillie Gifford aren't good enough to sponsor arts organisations, then who is? There will be no one, literally no one, who is pure enough to do this. And in a way, that's sort of part of the irony of what fossil fuel books are doing. They were communicating with people using a Gmail address. Alphabet, which owns Google, is one of the companies that they were demanding that Baillie Gifford divest from. I was, seeing Charlotte Church, one of the people who pulled out of Hay, saying that instead of doing her event at Hay, she'd do an Instagram Live. Well, Instagram has been systematically censoring Palestinians for years. That's been proven by Human Rights Watch. It's also one of the companies, Meta, that Baillie Gifford wanted, that was demanding that it divest from. So it seems extraordinarily hypocritical for fossil-free books to say it's all right for them to use these companies, but it's not all right for Hay Festival to receive funding from an investment company that invests in those companies. I really think that most people involved in this thought this was a good cause. I think they acted in good faith. I think they thought fossil-free books, it sounds right. But the actual details of what was being demanded of Baillie Gifford was absurd and extremely counterproductive. There is a very fragile ecosystem of arts organisations, which is really at risk now. Hay will probably be okay. It's very large. Edinburgh will probably be okay. It's pretty big as well. But much smaller festivals like, for example, Wigtown in southern Scotland, Can that survive without Baillie Gifford? Possibly not. And that is a huge blow. There are many small book festivals throughout, the United Kingdom that have really a quite worrying future as a result of this campaign. And I really, really wish that the activists involved and the people who supported the activist campaign had stopped and thought a little bit about what they were asking before they asked for it, because it's idiotic, frankly, and extremely counterproductive.
Oliver, thank you so much. That's Oliver Buller there, speaking to us from Hay on Wye. Well, it's time to talk art now with Ben Luke, who's review editor at The Art newspaper and host of its podcast. He joins me now in the studio. Ben, we're just hearing about Baillie Gifford and all these problems with sponsorship. Of course, there are some companies that are much more directly related to fossil fuels. BP is one of them, and they have a sponsorship deal with the British Museum. Now, we've just been reading about criticism of this by the Tate director, Maria Balshaw. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I like this, because I think museum directors should be more bold in talking about the wider climate other than just talking about themselves. And we don't often get museum directors who will say, actually, you know what, I think this is a problem. And Maria Balshaw, who's got a book out this week, was talking to The Observer on Sunday and said that she feels that the public has moved on effectively from fossil fuel sponsorship. They don't accept it. They find it's inappropriate, and they can see a dissonance between museums caring about communities and caring about ethics and so on, and then accepting money. And the British Museum has accepted a £50 million sponsorship from BP. And she's critical of it. And I think this sort of open debate about fossil fuel funding should be happening in the art world, because the fact is museums are strapped for cash. Museums are really struggling, especially in the wake of the pandemic. But the thing is that the British Museum is about the most struggling of all the museums. We know about the theft scandal last year, but it's falling apart. Go to the British Museum, and it's in real problems in terms of its fabric. And so they've accepted this £50 million sponsorship from BP, and inevitably that's created an enormous wave of criticism. And interestingly, our investigations at the Art newspaper have revealed that some trustees were deeply conflicted by this. But also, fascinatingly, George Osborne, former Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, who is the chair of the BP, recused himself from discussions about this sponsorship because his investment banking firm, Roby Warshaw, BP is one of their clients. So you get this idea that not only is it that museums are deeply connected to these fossil fuel companies, but also that the kind of management of them has its own interests. And so therefore it's right that Maria Balshaw is saying, we need to talk about BP, and we need to talk about fossil fuel, and we need to talk about ethics of sponsorship.
But Balshaw herself is the director of the Tate.
Yeah.
Tate, of course, famous sugar family. All of this money made from slavery. I mean, where does it stop? I
think that's the thing, is that it's an absolute minefield. And therefore, that from my perspective, is why there needs to be more of a discussion about it. Because then, and it needs to involve government. I want to see, let's say a Labour government does get in. I want to see an open and clear discussion about what they're going to do about funding and sponsorship. And if they're going to have green policies, how does that affect museums and how they're going to be funded moving forward? Because it needs to happen.
Yeah, so the public are taking things into their own hands in some instances and attacking works of art. One of the places that this has happened recently is in Paris.
Yes, indeed. The Musée d'Orsay, the famous poppies painting by Claude Monet, was attacked. It's in an impressionist exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay at the moment. And this time it's a glazed painting. Just to be clear, the painting was not damaged, but again, it was attacked. And this time a poster was was sort of stuck on the glass of the painting, which effectively represented that image 100 years in the future when, after 4 degrees warming. So effectively a burnt landscape, a destroyed landscape. And it's another example of this kind of protesting that is really common in museums, and that it seems is going to continue. But interestingly, Rachida Dati, the culture minister in France, is basically saying there should be new legislation specifically for this particular form of delinquency, as she calls it, this kind of protest that's happening in museums, because she quite rightly recognised it's not going to stop. And interestingly, the National Gallery in London has glazed lots of its paintings since these attacks. It's spending money to glaze its paintings because it's fearful that paintings may be really seriously damaged if they were not glazed. So it's, museums are making provision for this kind of attack in the future.
Let's head to Florence. The former director of the Uffizi is running for mayor of the city, but apparently, he misspoke.
He did. Yeah, this is Eike Schmidt, a German who recently gained Italian citizenship and is therefore able to stand for mayor of Florence. He was the director of the Uffizi, the great museum in Florence. He's standing with the backing of Giorgia Meloni, the far-right prime minister of Italy, interestingly. And yes, so he has made a statement in a leaflet in which he said that Florence is not Torre del Greco. Torre del Greco is a Neapolitan suburb, a town near Naples, which has severe social problems, and this has been seen as Eike Schmidt denigrating the south of Italy, denigrating its population, which has a long history in Italy. Clearly, Matteo Salvini, the far-right politician, famously talked about the stench of Neapolitans. This is an ongoing thing, and so he's been accused of doing that. He says it was just that he said he didn't want orange trees in Florence because he wants to return Florence to the magnificence of the Renaissance period. Whether he wants to return it to the period where they had plagues wiping out chunks of their population every now and again, I don't know. But he's talking about returning Florence to its sort of Renaissance magnificence, which sounds a bit like making America great again. But just to get a flavour of this is like Gabriele Finaldi from the National Gallery standing for Mayor of London on a Conservative ticket. It's an absurd situation and quite funny, actually.
Ben Luke, thank you very much indeed. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Vincent McAviney, Laura Kramer and Tom Webb, our researcher George Ruskin and our studio manager Lily Austin. After the headlines, there's more music on the way and the briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.